Good evening. It's nice to have you with us on this beautiful evening in Louisville, or wherever you are in the world, tuning into our Zoom annual event. I'm Dr. Jess Wright, and I'm the director of the University of Louisville Depression Center, your host for this evening's activity. Obviously, we're meeting virtually because of the pandemic, and we'll see what happens next year. But these virtual meetings do have some advantages of being able to reach people that couldn't come to Louisville to participate in tonight's activity, which I think is going to be a very exciting opportunity to meet with Dr. Christine Padesky, who's one of the world's leading authorities on cognitive behavior therapy and a very inspirational speaker. But before we get to the presentation for tonight, I do want to say just a few words about the Depression Center, which has been doing, I think, good work in treating a large number of people with depression and related conditions, with anxiety disorders, bipolar disorder, and other problems. Together with our affiliates in the departments of pediatrics and family medicine, internal medicine, we have about 50,000 or more visits with people with these conditions every year to the University of Louisville facilities. And we do a fair amount of research trying to find new answers for this age-old problem. And we do loads of education, including this program tonight, annual conferences, programs for residents, students, graduate students. And we also try to reach out to the community with a program that takes presentations into the community when we're able to. After the pandemic, I think we'll do that again. Now we've been doing those on Zoom with our Building Hope presentation series. So if you want to support us, we'll have a link that's in the chat room, or we'll show some slides later on that'll give you the information on how to make a donation if you're interested in doing that to the work of the University of Louisville Depression Center. We have a number of sponsors tonight, and I want to give a special thanks to them, people that have stepped up to help us with the event tonight and with our work at the Depression Center all year long. And I'm going to list each of them and thank them individually. Greg and Marilyn Bayer, Bluegrass Automotive, Dave and Valerie Casey, the Keith Collin and Family Foundation, Humana Inc., Julie Meredith, Julie Morton, the Pete Foundation, Susan Stokes, and myself and my wife, who's right here beside me. So thank you, Suzanne, for helping support the Depression Center. So tonight we have a really delightful program, and one that I think will be helpful to all of us, whether we suffer from problems like depression or anxiety, or we don't have those particular problems, but we're trying to find ways to be resilient against the stresses of life and to build the strengths that our inherent strengths, and utilize them to their best effect as we live out our lives. Dr. Padesky is the co-author of one of the most influential books ever written on cognitive behavior therapy. It's titled Mind Over Mood. And I'd highly recommend it to any of you. It's a workbook, so you work right along and write in it if you'd like to write in it, or you could, write on a piece of paper beside it. But it's really a wonderful book, and it's helped hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people with their problems with depression and anxiety and other kinds of problems. So I want to thank Dr. Padesky for writing that book and for continuing to revise it and make it very relatable to the problems we have in today's world. Dr. Padesky was also a founding fellow of the Academy of Cognitive Therapy, and I'm pleased to say that I can count her as a longtime friend. So we worked together on developing cognitive behavior therapy and teaching it, talking about it, and trying to promote it for many years. So it's great to have you with us today, Dr. Padesky. And I noticed that the title of your talk is very intriguing. We are all stronger than we think. So I'm curious about what that title means. Could you explain it for us?
Sure, I'll be glad to do that, Jess. And I want to first just say thank you to you and to the sponsors as well for inviting me, because this is such a great opportunity. And we have known each other for a long time. And I know that your depression center there in Louisville is actually one of the premier depression centers in the United States. I've referred people to you who even live in different states. So thank you for the work that you do as well. Uh, I titled this talk, "We Are All Stronger Than We Think," because every one of us underestimates our strengths and our abilities to manage life's many difficulties. This is a perfect year to be giving this talk because if we all think back to what was going on 1 year ago when this pandemic was in its early weeks and months, and I think many of us, if you had at that time in April of 2020 told us that we would be at home or working remotely or doing all the things we've had to do in the past year, that we'd be doing that not just for a matter of weeks or a month or two, but we'd be still doing that a year later. Many of us would have said, I can't do that. I can't handle that. That's going to be too hard. And it's that way with many things that go on in life. When we face difficult illnesses like cancer, or family members, people we love die, or we lose a job, or we go through financial hardship, face racial injustice, the things that we face in our life sometimes are so difficult and hard. And it's not unusual that our initial thought is, I can't deal with this. I just can't handle this. I can't get through it. And yet, here we are, a year later into the pandemic. Here we are, many of us having, over the course of this year, had many, many difficult things to deal with. And each of us, in our own way, have been resilient in managing all of these challenges over the past year. So that's what I want to talk about tonight. I want to talk about the ways in which each of us already are resilient and can become even more aware and practicing of resilience in our lives.
Are you saying that everyone's resilient?
Yes, I'm definitely saying everybody is resilient. It's interesting. I've been studying resilience and working with helping people be resilient for a long time now. And you and I know, Jess, when we look at depression or even anxiety or many other things that people come to therapy for, that when people come in and they're depressed, there's a lot of similarities. People who are depressed are more alike than different. When you and I get depressed, or the person down the street gets depressed, we have similar negative thoughts, similar reduced behavior, things like that. So there's commonalities in disorders and difficulties that we have in our life. The interesting thing about resilience is that there are a billion different ways to be resilient. Some people are resilient because they're really good problem solvers and they're able to figure their way out of tough spots. Other people are resilient. They may be poor problem solvers, but they have really good social skills and they can get people to come in and help them out. Some people have wicked good senses of humor and they use mood lifts throughout their week really well. Some people are resilient through a path of faith and spirituality that uplifts them and gives them purpose and meaning and helps them get on with their lives. So I am saying everybody's resilient, but the interesting thing about resilience is that everybody's resilient and we each are resilient in our own personal, individual way.
But we see, particularly in my practice, we see lots of folks that don't feel very resilient. Or they haven't been able to identify what about them is resilient. So what can they do?
Well, that's quite common. Most of us, if you say to us, what are your strengths, Jess? A lot of us will say, oh, I don't have a lot of strengths. And I think this is partly because for many people, when they hear resilience, they think of like, oh, I've got to be like super skilled, super talented. I've got to have like superpowers. But when I talk about everybody's resilient and we're all resilient in our own way, this comes about by a model of building resilience and helping people become more aware of their own resilience that I developed with Dr. Kathleen Mooney, psychologist that I've collaborated with over the past 40 years. And she and I have developed a 4-step approach, which helps people figure out their own, what we call personal model of resilience, a PMR, personal model of resilience. And if you like, I can I can walk you and everyone who's here today through it right now. I
That'd be
can show
terrific.
people
I think
how it
we'd all
works.
benefit from having an idea of what those 4 steps might be and how we could put them to work in our own lives.
Okay,
So
great.
I'm all ears. Go
Okay.
ahead.
Well, good. Well, okay. I said it's not like superpowers. We don't have to be like the X-Men or anything. This is the thing that we found really interesting in our work is that we think the secret to discovering our own resilience is actually in very tiny, small, everyday events. And so the first step of our approach is 4 steps. The 4 steps are search, construct, apply, and practice. So the search step is actually kind of fun because I want everybody who's watching to think about something that you do every day or nearly every day. And in particular, I want you to think about something you enjoy or that you look forward to that's not really connected to problems in your life. So it can be something very simple, like some people just enjoy making coffee in the morning and sitting and sipping that first cup of coffee. It could be something like playing with your dog or some kind of pet that you have. Might be taking a walk. Some people might tinker in the garage and rebuild car engines, and it's a passion for them. Cooking could be it. Playing video games, watching YouTube videos. It doesn't have to be anything special or anything that seems really like a spectacular skill. Some people do have pretty good skills, like playing a musical instrument would be an example. Now, the reason I'm asking you to pick something that you do every day is it turns out that when we're doing things we enjoy and things that are in our comfort zone, we actually are quite resilient, but we don't even have to think about it because we're just doing the thing we like to do. And so once you identify that thing, I hope everyone's thought of something right now for themselves. We then want to think about when you're doing that thing on a regular basis. Fortunately, anything we do regularly is going to sometimes run into obstacles. And we can't even begin to think about resilience unless we're thinking about dealing with challenges and obstacles. So now that you've got that thing that you like, the small thing you do on a regular basis, see if you can identify 3 or 4 obstacles that come up commonly in doing that thing. I'll just give you an example. One of my thing during the pandemic has been cooking. I actually like to cook. And so I've been trying to experiment and once a week at least cook something different that I've never cooked before. I've been getting recipes and things. So what would be some common obstacles that come up in cooking? Well, sometimes I get partway through a recipe and I realize I'm missing one of the ingredients. There are days, even though I generally like to cook, where I don't feel like it. That would be an obstacle. Occasionally I look at a recipe and I thought I understood what they're asking me to do, but there's parts of it I just don't understand. Sometimes I overcook something so it dries out. So those would be the kind of things we think about as obstacles. Now, those are kind of small things. But the interesting thing in terms of resilience is, what do you do when those obstacles come up? Because we each have our own natural way of handling things. So that's the second step, which is constructing our personal model of resilience. And just from knowing that thing you do and what some common obstacles are that you face, you have all the ingredients that you need to come up with your own personal way of thinking about resilience. Now, sometimes if I'm doing this in therapy with people, I encourage them to come up with their own, personal model. Resilience is kind of a mouthful. I encourage them to come up with their own colorful way of talking about it. Since I'm talking about cooking, I might come up with a title for mine, something like My Recipe for Getting Through Things. So I would then think about, when those obstacles come up, what do I do? So when I'm missing ingredients, I can think of over the last year, that's happened to me a number of times. Sometimes I've called a neighbor and said, do you have this ingredient? I'm right in the middle of cooking something and I realize I don't have any vegetable oil in the kitchen. Sometimes if it's early on in the process and I realize I'm missing ingredients, I might switch to a different dinner plan, just change recipes. Or I've gone online and looked for what's a good substitute for cilantro, so I might look up a substitute. Now, those are three little things for cooking, and I can write them down in my recipe for getting through things. But when I write them down, first I'll write them down as my kind of cooking plan, but then later I'm going to reflect on it and think, if I was making like a general life handbook, what would I call these things? So calling a neighbor, I might say, ask someone to help me when I'm in a tough time. So that might be one principle that I'm comfortable with. Second thing is I am comfortable changing plans. So changing a recipe might change your plan a little bit. It might be think about what else would work if I'm missing something. Now, another obstacle I think of is like when I don't feel like cooking, one of the things that I've discovered this year helps me if I'm just dragging at the end of the day and I don't feel like cooking a meal is I'll sometimes put on music to lighten the mood. It gives me energy and kind of makes everything a little bit more fun. So I might add to my personal model resilience, lighten the mood. And that might include ideas like try to see the humor in the situation or play some music. So now I've got a list of, if I went through each of my obstacles, I'd probably have a list of 6, 7 things that I do. These can be behaviors, they can be attitudes. It could be things like think about other people. If I'm cooking for someone else, then I could say, this is like a service I'm doing for them, and service is a value of mine. So, doing good for other people might be something that motivates me and helps me get through hard times. So I have my list of things here, natural ways that I'm resilient when I'm doing something I like to do. And the third step is to then apply it to areas of my life where I'm less resilient. So, for example, for me, I'd start by thinking of some small area where I feel challenged. I don't feel very resilient. And one thing that comes to mind might be tidying up my garage, because my garage has gotten quite filled with stuff over the past year. So when I'm not feeling resilient, I walk out to the garage and I think, I'm going to work on cleaning up the garage today. And I just look at it and say, it's too much. And I just go back in the house and say, forget it. But if I use my recipe for getting through things, I could look at the list. It helps if it's written down. I could look at my list and say, what's on my list that would help me stick to it a little bit longer and really work in the garage a little bit, tidying it up. And so as I look through my list, I might see play music. Well, that's a good idea. I could put some music on. That might help. Ask someone to help. Maybe there's somebody who can help me out. Could consider a change in plans. Maybe instead of tackling the whole garage, if it's too much, maybe I could pick one section of the garage. That'd be a good place to start and start working there. I could think of ways to do other uplifts or use humor. I could take a photo of it and text it to a friend and say, here's the before picture, hold me to it. In 4 hours, I'm going to send you the after picture. Things that just kind of lighten the mood and make it more fun. So that's the third step, is to take your personal model resilience and try it out in some small area of your life where you could benefit from being a bit more resilient. And then the fourth step is if it works and you can kind of tinker with and add ideas to your personal model resilience as you go along, the fourth thing then is throughout your life to practice being resilient. Now, for most of us, cleaning the garage isn't our biggest life challenge, but by working on that as kind of a metaphor for a week or so, and by practicing staying resilient when I want to give up, that's going to boost my confidence that I can be resilient. And then with bigger struggles in my life, illness, maybe going through cancer treatment, grieving the death of somebody who's died, dealing with social injustice. Some people have lost their jobs or they have financial worries. These are big problems that we can't always solve, at least not quickly. And so what I find helpful is to consider it a win if you can get up every day and face the problems. Staying resilient in the face of problems is sometimes just as meaningful, if not more meaningful, than actually solving a problem. I work with people to really try to handle the problems and just keep standing up in the face of them. They have a saying in Asia, which is get knocked down 7 times, stand up 8. And that's a good description of what resilience is, that you may feel knocked down and you may have a day where you close your mind to it and you say, I just can't deal with it today. But the next day you get up and you face it again. And by doing that, by remaining resilient, we really have 2 chances to get on well in life. You know, when we're facing a serious problem, sometimes we can solve it and we can work our way through the problem, and that's a good win. But there are a lot of problems in life that we really can't work our way through. And so for those types of issues, if we can keep showing up and keep being resilient and give ourselves credit for that, say, you know, here I am another day facing this thing and I'm still here. And that's another way of winning. And so this 4-step process is kind of simple, and it's one that pretty much anybody can do. But what I found is when people practice being resilient and giving themselves credit for being resilient in the face of tough problems and counting each day that they keep standing up as a win, that really helps people feel a lot better over time.
Do you think that you can actually practice this and build your skills and resilience over a period of time? Do you see that with your patients or the people you work with? That they
absolutely, Jess. When we do this model, it actually does make people they begin to get more confident that they can be resilient. And when they come to me, I'll give you an example of what I mean by practicing resilience. Sometimes people come in and they'll say, you know, I still haven't found a job, but I did send out some more resumes this week, and I did this and I did that. And they'll be doing that, practicing resilience. And then they'll come in and they might say, you know, I got a job. I got a job this week. And I'll say, oh, that's great. And I'll be celebrating that with them. And I'll say, you know, but it's kind of too bad you got a job. And they'll say, what do you mean? And I'll say, well, now you won't have to keep practicing. You won't have another chance tomorrow to practice resiliency because now you got your job. This obstacle has been removed from you. And I'm partly being humorous, but people do what my clients say to me is they say in the past, when they've been in therapy, they often think if they aren't getting better day after day after day, that somehow they're failing or not doing very well. But, you know, like you, Jess, I've worked with a lot of people who've had chronic, long-standing depressions or who've had, you know, lifelong struggles with substance misuse or all kinds of things. And sometimes they can feel, I think in our society where kind of being problem-free is admired, they can feel like, oh, I'm a failure because I'm still depressed or I've been, and in my mind, I don't know what you think, Jess, but in my mind, those people who've struggled with lifelong chronic difficulties, those are the most successful, courageous people that I've met in my life, because to get up day after day after day when you're struggling with a heavy burden of depression or alcoholism or something like that, that's admirable. If you keep showing up and you keep getting up and you put one foot in front of another and work through that for another day. So I'm trying to get people to see that that is as big of a success as defeating a problem.
Yeah, I certainly agree with you. I've been influenced a lot by the work of Viktor Frankl, who talks about finding meaning or purpose in life. And I remember, you know, he was a survivor of the concentration camp at Auschwitz. And that, of course, was an experience that it's hard to fathom, but came out of that with the idea that facing adversity, that there was something that could really be gained out of that. And you're talking about that from the lens or the perspective of building resilience. I certainly can agree with you on that one. Now, as you were talking about helping patients with this, I was thinking about people that have been traumatized really severely, and how this might fit with that kind of problem. I imagine that the people that are tuning in tonight, a fair amount have had traumas, grief, losses, assaults, all kinds of things. And we talk about how some people can seem to weather that to some extent, and others it's much harder to weather. And I wonder if your 4-step model could be helpful to people that have gone through those kind of experiences.
Well, yes. Of course, we also have really good treatments that can, in a fairly short time, help people who are experiencing what we call post-traumatic stress disorder. If they have PTSD, it can help them work their way through it. And a big part of that is helping people discover the meaning and correct some of the kind of self-criticism and things that can be associated with trauma. But yes, I mean, anyone who's been through trauma, and many people have, anyone who's been through trauma who continues to get up and show up and live their life, they're having to be resilient. The interesting thing is that we found that the majority of people, after they do go through a trauma, initially you're kind of thrown off and your life is quite discombobulated for some time. I mean, that's normal and to be expected. But then over time, people often find that having been through a trauma, maybe even just the fact that they survived it and were able to eventually resume their life and continue living in a good way, that many people say that trauma did make them more resilient. And because one of the things that can come out of trauma is a sense of ourselves as a survivor, and our sense of ourselves that we are stronger than we think. And that if I can get through that, then maybe some of the other things that I face in life aren't going to be quite as difficult. But for people who are stuck and having trouble moving through trauma, this resilience model could certainly be of help to them.
I'm seeing this as a very hopeful and inspiring approach, which is a bit different than, say, the classic method that a cognitive therapist or some other therapist might do of focusing on the things that aren't working.
Yeah.
The problems, the negative thoughts, the self-criticism, and you can get mired in that so much that maybe sometimes that maybe just reinforces.
Yes. We call our approach strengths-based CBT, and it's because we're really highlighting and trying to identify people's natural strengths. It's not like we have to teach people strengths. We all are strong in our own way. And it's one of the things that I like is this idea about finding what people are already naturally doing, and then thinking, how could those things that they're already naturally doing in one area of their life, how can those skills help them in another area of their life where they're maybe struggling quite a bit more?
Right. Another application that I was thinking about are people that suffer from chronic pain, which really could be a terrible thing. People with pancreatitis, chronic pancreatitis, or chronic back problems or whatever, and they go to doctor after doctor or take medicines and still have it every day. And I'm thinking that I better learn how to use this with my patients that suffer from that it might be very helpful to them.
Yeah, I think it is a very helpful model for chronic pain, because that's a good example of a problem that you may not be able to solve. And so if people are trying to eliminate the pain, then, there's only so far sometimes you can go with certain chronic pain issues. But if you can learn to be resilient in the face of the pain and to lighten your load of the pain, that can make a very positive effect in people's lives.
Is there any sense that if you go through these 4 steps and keep practicing it, that it in any way prevents or reduces the risk of getting depressed or becoming somebody that suffers from a great deal of anxiety?
The answer to that question, the honest answer is yes and no. The yes part is that there was a study that was done in Germany using our 4-step model. And what they did was an interesting study. They took first-year university students, and people who've been to university might recognize that the first year at university is often quite stressful for young people. Although they're excited about it, it's first time away from home often, and there's a lot of work to do and self-management, and it can be tough meeting new people and all that. And there's a pretty high incidence of depression and anxiety in first year undergraduates by the end of their first few months at university. So this team in Germany, when they came to some training that we did and learned how to use this four-step model, they decided to do a study, and they took university students in their first month at university, and they set up a study where half the students got a 3.5-hour training program in our 4 steps, and the other half didn't get an intervention at all. And then they tracked the students over time. And the students who'd had the resilience training at the end of their first semester at university had significantly lower rates of depression and anxiety, had higher self-esteem, had a higher sense of well-being than those who hadn't gotten that training. So we were really heartened by these results, that it looks like this 4-step model can have kind of an inoculation effect, that if you focus on resilience rather than solving and defeating all the problems in your life, that it can actually help you feel better. But that said, I don't want to be unrealistic about it. I mean, even the most resilient people become depressed and anxious sometimes. Being resilient doesn't mean you're happy with your life necessarily. I know all of us, probably on this call, and myself included this year, had days or even weeks where we maybe felt more depressed or more anxious. And being resilient and practicing good CBT skills isn't a guarantee that those things won't happen to you. But when we do become depressed and anxious, and that's when the other CBT skills that you and I regularly teach people to use, Jess, are helpful. So for example, I'll give a shout out. You, and I know your daughter, who's an MD, Laura McRae, wrote a really good book called Breaking Free from Depression, Pathways to Wellness. And a book like that, as well as the book that Dennis Greenberger and I wrote, Mind Over Mood, these are books that teach people skills that can help them when they do get depressed or anxious. So I think learning resilience models will help reduce our risk of depression and anxiety, but it's certainly, if the stresses and strains and challenges get big enough and come at us fast enough, most of us are going to at some point feel depressed and anxious. But we should know there are things we can do about that as well. And we can use our resilience kind of attitude to stick to and practice the skills there that are helpful. So for example, in the Mind Over Mood book, we target depression, anxiety, anger, guilt, and shame as moods. And we actually have reading guides. So because people should know, it's interesting, but there's different skills that help us with different moods. It's not like learn these 3 skills and it'll help you with all moods. So for example, in our book, we have reading guides in the back of the book that say, if you're depressed, read the chapters in this order. If you're anxious, read these chapters in this order, because we're trying to target the skills that are most helpful for particular moods. In cognitive behavior therapy, we have such good research over the last 40 years about what types of skills help people manage and reduce certain problematic moods in their life. So, for example, for depression, people learn to plan activities in their day. Activities, especially if they're doing things that mean something to us, can be quite antidepressant, and also to identify and test out negative thoughts. With anxiety, if we're feeling anxiety, we need to really learn to approach what we fear and practice coping with the things that we're afraid might happen. We learn things like we tend to, when we're anxious, overestimate danger and underestimate coping and resources. So there's a variety of different skills for different moods. And if people want to know in the Q&A section about any of those, we can certainly address those. So yes, resilience will reduce our risk for depression, anxiety, things like that. but no, it's not a panacea. We're going to need to be resilient sometimes in facing those moods as well. They can become a problem in our life.
I'm hearing that it really enriches and adds a great deal to the standard kinds of approaches, and well worth thinking about. And I was wondering if some of my patients are tuned in today, they'd wonder, well, Dr. Wright, you haven't been doing much of that with me, so I guess I better learn my lesson.
Well, and in fact, that's what we do, Jess. I mean, we don't necessarily, it's a rare client who would come in where we would just do this resilience model with them. Most of the time, what we're doing is we're doing standard cognitive behavior therapy for depression, anxiety, guilt, shame, whatever the issue is that brings them to therapy, trauma. And then at some point in the treatment, almost everybody kind of hits a wall where they say, oh, I'm working so hard, I'm practicing these skills, but I'm still feeling not great all the time. And they kind of want to give up or, not keep going. And that's a good time to introduce this resilience model to say, instead of 2 steps forward and then you get a little stalled and then you just want to give up, maybe you could practice being resilient and sticking to it, even through some of the tougher, rougher spots. And so I think the combination, if people are depressed or anxious or having trauma or other substance struggles, I think the combination of CBT with this kind of resilience focus gives people 2 sets of superpowers. You've got a set of superpowers in terms of managing, real moods that are on board. And then you've also got this kind of personal model of resilience that can help you keep standing up and facing things.
I want to come back to the title for a minute, because we started with that.
Yeah.
We are all stronger than we think. And I think that's a really powerful message that we all need to really let it seep into our brains. And people that are out there that have suffered from depression and anxiety and other kinds of problems, that's a really potent thing to think about and try to identify that and work with that with your own therapists. Now we're going to move to a Q&A pretty soon, but before we do, I have one more question that wasn't in our script at all, Dr. Padesky, but you've been doing therapy for a long time and have been one of the major persons involved with developing cognitive behavior therapy. What are the 1 or 2 or 3 main things that you have learned that you think are so important in your clinical work with patients?
Well, let's see. There's a lot of things I've learned. I think, some of the things I've learned have been things about people in general. And I've been very impressed over the long decades of my career, been very impressed by how people are in fact all strong and have within them certain wisdom and a sense of what to do when we quiet and leave room for that. As you know, I do a lot of teaching of cognitive behavior therapy to therapists all around the world in workshops and consultation. And one of the things that I find is that I'm constantly telling therapists, don't do all the work, because the people who are coming to therapy, they are so internally wise and they know much better than you do how these skills could be helpful to them. And so one of the things that I learned really was to listen to the people who come to see me for help and appreciate their natural skills, to kind of look for what are they doing in areas of their life where they're not struggling, and to really pay attention to that. But the other things the things I've learned are really a bit mood dependent, because I've worked a lot with different moods over the course of my career. And with depression work, I've learned that it really is true that doing things during the day can be a good antidote to depression, a good antidepressant, but that we can really supercharge those activities if we're tying them in with the value, what means a lot to us, our values and meaning in our life. And I've also learned that the kind of negative thoughts that we have are often, we each have our own themes that we tend to go over and over and over again. So when I'm working with people who are depressed, sometimes it's a bit daunting to them because they might have thousands of negative thoughts throughout the day. And when I say, oh, we're going to learn to identify those negative thoughts and test them out, they think, oh my gosh, this is going to take so long. But in fact, the same types of negative thoughts come up for people over and over again. And so once you learn to identify, a dozen or so negative thoughts that you have and learn to kind of look at things in a more complete whole way, where you're looking at the good news and the bad news in your life both equally, then people find out that, it's really not thousands of different negative thoughts they're having during the day. There's like a dozen thoughts that they're recycling over and over and over again. And that makes it a bit more manageable. With anxiety, I've learned that I and the people I work with can move a lot faster than you think if you're working together. So I used to be very slow and patient in my work with anxiety, but we've really learned from the research and from our clinical work and experimenting that you can move quite quickly with anxiety disorders. And I've been impressed over the years that most anxiety problems can be treated within a matter of just 2 or 3 months. And chronic anxiety may take a bit longer, but people can make really pretty fast progress. So the main thing I'd want people listening to know is that these things that seem so difficult and so impossible to overcome, that if you get matched up with a good therapist who understands that issue, you can often make really significant progress in just a matter of months that can last for what you learn, the skills you learn can help you the rest of your life. So it's an investment well worth making.
Well, thanks for fielding that question, which was unexpected, but I wanted to tap into your really deep wisdom and thank you for sharing those insights.
You're welcome, Jess.
Very encouraging to therapists and to patients and to families of people that are going through treatment, that this stuff does work. And sometimes it can work quicker than you think. It might not be an interminable process.
Yeah.
We're going to have an opportunity for questions and answers, so please use the Q&A form on the Zoom app. It says Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and type in your questions. And I'm going to field the questions and send them over to Dr. Padesky. And in the meantime, I just want to remind you that this is a benefit event for the University of Louisville Depression Center. We've had sponsors that have been able to help us have Dr. Padesky here and to put this together, and also to help us with our annual expenses and moving ahead with our mission. But if you want to help us out, there is a slide that we'll show here momentarily. And I believe in the chat area, there's also the link for making a donation to the Depression Center. So let's move on to some questions and see what is there.
While we're waiting for them, I'll give a shout out. I know a number of the people in listening to this are friends and family of mine. I actually have people here from California to Alabama and Arizona to Minnesota and probably Kentucky, because I've got some cousins I was telling you in Kentucky and Pennsylvania and kind of all across the country. So it's exciting for me to get to speak to people that I know, as well as I wish I was there meeting all the people that I've not yet met.
So our first question is, could you repeat each of the 4 steps, not in detail, but just so we're sure we grasp what they are and how to perhaps implement them?
Sure. So the first step is to search for an area of your life that you do regularly, that you naturally kind of enjoy, or you do it without a lot of difficulty. You're going to introduce obstacles and think about how do you handle those obstacles in that kind of easier, more pleasant area of your life. And you're going to use those to, second, construct your personal model of resilience. List out all the strategies you use to help you handle obstacles. Then the third one is going to be to apply that personal model of resilience to some, at first, struggle in your life where you're not very resilient, but don't pick your biggest struggle to start out with. Practice with something a little bit easier. And then you're going to, fourth, practice in every area of your life, trying to hang in there and be resilient. Sometimes I ask people, in the face of this difficulty, let's take chronic pain, for instance, in the face of this difficulty, do you think you could keep a resilient mindset and try to be resilient for maybe 10 minutes? And then maybe expand that to 15 minutes. So it's a matter of kind of building up your resilience muscle and trying to be resilient as much as possible. So search, construct, apply, and practice.
Thank you. I like the image of building up your resilience muscle, sort of like you can train it.
Yeah, you can.
Like go into the resilience gym or something.
Exactly.
It doesn't sound that hard, like you have to go and lift weights. It can be more pleasant than that when you talk about cooking and other things. So
exactly.
So let's go on to our next question. Can you give some advice for dealing with guilt? And this questioner says she suffers from depression. And I gather she must also, the guilt is part of that experience.
Sure. Guilt is one of those emotions that we tend to feel guilty when we think when we've done something that violates our own standards and values. So guilt's kind of personal in a way, because the same action, some people might not feel guilty about it and other people would feel guilty about it. So it depends if you're violating some value or belief that you have, that this is what I want to be a good person. So in some ways, guilt can be a good emotion sometimes, because it kind of lets us know we've kind of fallen off the path of our own values and the kind of person that we want to be. But usually when people ask about guilt, it's because they feel guilt either way more often than other people, and they might feel guilty about lots of little things. And in that case, we have in the chapter 15 of the Mind Over Mood book, which is a chapter on anger, guilt, and shame, we've got a number of exercises there that help people kind of put in perspective. So if you're someone who feels guilty about lots of fairly small things during the day, but then you can't get them out of your mind, it can be helpful to kind of make a continuum of all the bad things people could do and put the things you're doing on this continuum. And you often discover when you put it on a continuum along with real serious things like mass murder and, terrible things that people might do to others, torture, that the things you're feeling guilty about may not be quite so big. But the other thing is when we feel guilty, it's usually because we've hurt someone. And we also have some exercises in there that help how to approach someone and make a sincere apology, make reparations. And then eventually you may have to practice another exercise in that chapter, which is self-forgiveness, because none of us are perfect. We all violate our own standards and rules and the beliefs that we have of what it means to be a good person. All of us fall short of that at times. So part of dealing with guilt is addressing and changing behavior that really is not good behavior. Guilt's kind of a warning signal, I'm off the path here. But it also can involve self-compassion and accepting our imperfections. So I don't know where the person who wrote this question falls on that continuum, but in the whole group listening, I'm sure there are some people on every point along that continuum of guilt experience.
Our next question is, can this work be done with any age group? This questioner is specifically thinking of using this with elementary students, which I find that really interesting and exciting.
Yeah, I actually think you could use it with, I've done a lot of work over my career with children, and I've learned that almost every idea that we come up with in cognitive behavior therapy can be done with children. The one thing to think about is with kids, I could imagine doing this in a group with kids. And in fact, there was a group in Mexico who took this model and they were using it with somewhat older kids between the ages of 8 and 12. So kind of late elementary school, middle school kids. And they were doing it with them in groups. And the children they were doing it with came from homes where there was a lot of poverty and The parents were fairly absent. There was quite a bit of drug use and difficulties that the kids had a lot of adversity in their lives, in other words. And what they did is they formed an after-school group with the kids, and they helped each of the kids identify the areas of their life, things they'd like to do when they had some free time, and the things that they enjoyed doing, like playing video games or texting their friends or making up new dances or whatever it was that they liked to do. And then they introduced, talked about the obstacles and found out how the kids worked through those obstacles when they were doing things they genuinely loved to do. And the kids came up with all kinds of ways to practice resiliency. And then as a group, they talked about how to handle then some of the very serious problems they were dealing with at home and in the broader community. And they said the kids got very energized and loved it. I mean, it can be a very action-oriented approach. So I would encourage them. And if they do use it in an elementary school program, I hope they'll write to me and tell me what they discover and learn.
Yeah, again, so exciting. The next question shows one of the tremendous values of Zoom. And I'm pretty sure that this questioner is sending his question from Istanbul, Turkey. It's from Mehmet Sungar, who is someone that both Christine Padesky and I.
Yes, hi, Mehmet.
He's thanking us for our chat today. And he mentions that finding meaning in pain may be at least as good as handling pain. And then he goes on to wonder about whether this kind of work could help patients with schizophrenia who could find meaning in their lives and resilience in the face of this really profound illness.
Yes, absolutely. And in fact, we have some colleagues in England who've come and done training with us, Mehmet, and they've gone back and used this with young people with psychosis as well as older adults with psychosis. And they learn it just as well as anyone else. I think Dr. Beck, Aaron T. Beck, who founded Cognitive Behavior Therapy, has developed with his colleagues in Philadelphia new what they call recovery-based treatment for people with psychosis. And it's actually, we were talking to Dr. Beck about this a few years before they developed that model, and he was quite interested in it. And he took a lot of the ideas from our strengths-based approach and our resilience approach and embedded it in his new treatment for psychosis, looking for strengths and what people do naturally well and what naturally motivates people. And they've been having very good outcomes. So I think this is such a simple, individualized approach that I think it's good for just about, anybody who wants to be more resilient could use this quite fruitfully, I think.
Mm-hmm. I've seen this in my practice of patients with psychosis, an illness that is one that's hard to make go away completely. Sometimes people are fortunate and the medications take a lot of it away, but typically it's dealing with ongoing problems, hallucinations, paranoia, and so forth. And learning how to become resilient in the face of this seems to be a very important thing to do.
Yes, and I think, with psychosis, the more people do learn to be resilient and learn to cope with many of the struggles and extra challenges that they have, what we found in the outcome studies is that they not only feel better and can manage it better, but some of the symptoms like hallucinations and voices and things actually decrease as their confidence that they can handle it go up, mm-hmm. and as their belief that these aren't so dangerous. So
I might add that we might need to teach some of the people that treat conditions like schizophrenia the same kind of perspective.
Yes.
One of the problems with a medical model of a condition like schizophrenia is that it's a brain disease and the brain is broken, and the only way to treat that is through a medication. As a psychiatrist, I certainly do prescribe medications for these severe illnesses. On the other hand, there's a great deal that one can gain from learning to cope, learning how to use resiliency skills and build resiliency skills.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but we need to move on, and we are going to keep pretty tight to the time clock today, Dr. Padesky, and we're going to have about 5 more minutes before we wrap up.
Sure.
So we're going to go through some of these questions a little more quickly. But this one is a little tough. Have you come up with any challenges in helping people develop their personal model of resilience? And this is from somebody that must have heard you talk before, because she says, I always learn so much from you. Thank you, Cindy.
Okay. Well, there's challenges in doing everything, but I would say I like to stay resilient in the face of those challenges. This is where, as a therapist, I take it that Cindy might be a therapist. So as a therapist, when you do run into challenges, I find the best thing to do is to go public with those challenges with the person you're working with and say, we keep getting stuck here. What do you think about that? How can we work our way through this? And I've often found that, my clients are my best supervisors. They give me good feedback and say, well, this isn't working because of this. Maybe we should try that. So if somebody really wants to be resilient, I think discouragement that people naturally feel when they have a lot of challenges and struggles in their life, and it's normal to feel discouraged when you're faced with difficult things. Discouragement can make therapy sometimes a challenge, but I think the antidote to discouragement is trying small things on a daily basis, because if you actually try things out, you're either going to get a useful result you can learn from or a not useful result. If you get a useful result, learn from it, and that encourages you and kind of eats away at the discouragement. If you get a not useful result, then that tells you this one path isn't working so well. Let's tinker with it. Let's try something a little different. So I think I tend to not run into so many difficulties in therapy because I am someone who practices resiliency, and I'm not necessarily put off by difficulties or discouragement or challenges. I try to work with people to learn from it. And I think as long as you keep a learning attitude and someone's interested in building resilience, I can't really think of obstacles that have derailed it so much. Most people really find it kind of fun and interesting to do this.
Well, that's a story of a therapist's resilience, it sounds like.
Yeah.
And we have a related question from a therapist from the United Kingdom. So we really are having an international discussion today. And this therapist points out that therapists may have difficulties in utilizing this approach. And he wonders what they can do. How can they cultivate traits or skills that complement this approach that you're talking about, Dr. Padesky? He says, for instance, you seem to be genuinely really trust the inner wisdom in others. And he wonders what the other therapists can practice or learn that might help them utilize this model.
Sure. Well, one of the things is with therapists, we have in cognitive therapy, in addition to automatic thoughts, which pop into our mind throughout the day, we deal a lot with what we call underlying assumptions, if-then beliefs. And we all have underlying assumptions that affect how we approach people in relationships. Therapy is just one kind of relationship. So if as a therapist, we have a belief that if my client's stuck, then it's my responsibility to figure it out and help them. We're going to always look to ourselves to give advice or to figure things out. But I think it's helpful for therapists who feel stuck applying any model to think about their own if-then assumption beliefs. So I find an impediment to this model is therapists who believe if I really collaborate closely and let my client be in the driver's seat in therapy, then they're not going to make much progress, or they're not going to know what to do, or then they're going to think less of me as a therapist. Those therapists are going to have more struggles doing this approach. So I think that's one thing, but I think as therapists, we need to, it can be quite, we can get sucked into believing, we see so much negativity in people's lives. We see the aftermath of really tough things that have happened to people. And that can sometimes tilt our worldview. And I think it's very important for us as therapists for us to cultivate in ourselves a balanced perspective that, yes, there's a lot of bad things in the world that happen, but there's also joy and love and good things in the world too. And when we are talking to clients, it's important that we not just talk about the negative things, but we also talk about the positive things in their life that give positive meaning and joy to their lives. And when we do that, I think we often have a much broader view of how we can help the people who come to us.
Well, I want to thank all of our sponsors. I want to thank Robert Caudle, who helped with the tech aspects of this presentation, Carol Wall, who helped set it up, and especially Dr. Padesky, who has had a really terrific presentation and has responded to all these questions, even questions that I've thrown at her, and thank you for that. And we hope that you'll consider supporting our Depression Center's work at Louisville. We're still trying to do more to help understand depression and related problems and try to treat more people with the best treatments we know of. So I want to thank again everyone one more time and sign off for tonight, and wish you all well.
Thank you, Jess.